Welcome everyone to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening science presentation series put on by University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus here in Nome, and also UAF Alaska Sea Grant, also in Nome. And UAF Northwest Campus and Alaska Sea Grant, we are public servants of the Bering Strait region. We serve all peoples of the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, Central Yupik, and St. Lawrence Island Yupik peoples. So tonight's speaker, pretty exciting for us at UAF to have the director of the UAF International Arctic Research Center want to talk to the Bering Strait region, but he does, and that is Hajo Eicken. He's zooming in tonight from Fairbanks, and he's going to talk to us. He's no stranger to the Bering Strait region and no stranger to the Arctic, as you can imagine. He's in charge of the Arctic Research Center. And he's going to be talking about how long-term observations benefit Indigenous peoples, or how can long-term observations benefit Indigenous peoples. And he's going to be talking about the ROAD, R-O-A-D, initiative that is taking aim at getting at that lofty goal. And he's also going to be talking what it might mean for the Bering Strait region. So we're always interested. Hajo, thank you so much for zooming in from Fairbanks tonight, and we're so happy you joined us. Take it away. You might want to put up your title slide.
Yes, thanks, Gay. Really appreciate it. Great to see this crowd here. A great mix of people. Thank you, in particular, Gay, for organizing this. I learned today talking to you. This is the 200 and something.
Yeah, I could look it up for you. I'll look it up for the end.
Yeah,
over 200.
Great. So I'm Hajo Eicken. Just a few words about myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm serving currently as director of the International Arctic Research Center here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks on the Trothyadak campus. I'm a sea ice researcher. I came to Alaska 25 years ago to specifically work out on the sea ice, mostly in northern Alaska. So I haven't really spent much time in the Bering Straits region, but I had the privilege starting in 2006 to start working with Winton Wayapuk and others from Kinglingen or the community of Wales and the Bering Strait itself. That's been a great collaboration. Winton sadly passed away a few years ago, but I really do care about the Bering Straits region, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk to you here today. So the presentation I wanted to share today is going to try and strike a bit of a balance here between talking more about broader research questions that may relate to the Bering Straits region, but at the same time also try to tease out in a bit more detail how, in particular, observations conducted by the broader research community or agencies that focus on the long time scale can help benefit local and in particular Indigenous communities in the region. Now, first off, though, happy solstice. I did want to share something. I appreciate you all are probably real busy getting ready for the holidays. If you haven't gotten all your presents together yet, I'd like to highlight this beautiful book that just appeared a few days ago in print, also an electronic copy here, by a number of authors led by Donna Hauser, with contributions from the Kotzebue region. John Goodwin, Cyrus Harris, Pearl Goodwin contribute to this. Fantastic photos and lots of really nice drawings here by Heather McFarland, who's also here at International Arctic Research Center, IARC for short. So I can highly recommend this as a late Christmas gift if you're still shopping. So let's then dive into the presentation itself. I don't think we have anybody on the phone here, so I'll try and just focus on the visuals of the slides here. And if people have pressing questions, I can't read the chat, but maybe feel free to just jump in and ask a question. We're a fairly small audience here, so if you have a burning issue or something you want me to clarify, just jump right in.
And Hajo, I monitor the chat. This is Gay. I'll help you there.
Great, I appreciate it. Thank you. So basically 5 parts to the presentation. I want to start out talking a bit more about just the sort of the classic, myself being an academic, not very much steeped in action on the ground. How do we think as university researchers about long-term observations of Arctic change? And then specifically ask the question whether communities such as Nome, other coastal communities in the region, indigenous peoples more broadly, are being served well by these long-term observations. Of course, that's not a question I can't answer. I can't speak for these communities, but I'm working with a number of others on a project that has the acronym ROADS, or the Roadmap for Arctic Observing and Data Systems. And it's that project that I want to share a bit more about with you today, delving into some of the practical aspects of how can we make observations more meaningful and more relevant to people at the community scale. In particular, as Gay, you know well, and I know others here on the call have long been advocates and involved with work that seeks to achieve better equity in serving and working with indigenous peoples of the Arctic who live in the region, have long reported on, understood, and thought about the changes in the Arctic and variations over time in a holistic fashion, trying to bring that together with our research perspectives and making sure that research at least attempts in a meaningful way to better serve communities in the region. So the concept I want to introduce here as well that I'll talk a bit more about are these so-called shared Arctic variables. I'll give you a specific example about salmon that some of us are working on. I do want to then also ask the question, well, how can we be more effective in sharing information with people in the region? And the example I want to use there is the CS4 Walrus Outlook, a collaborative effort that is covering a significant part of the Bering Straits region. And then just add with a few thoughts specifically on what might be of interest for people in the Seward Peninsula region, Nome, and beyond. So the first question then is long-term observations of Arctic change. So what you see here on the right-hand side is a plot generated by Ann Nguyen with the University of Texas, El Paso. You see a bunch of dots across the Arctic Ocean and some of the marginal seas. This is a seminal work. Like, this is a major, major effort that Ann Nguyen has led in collaboration with others, extracting, collating, then analyzing and putting into a so-called inverse modeling framework a lot of observations made across the Arctic Ocean, across time, asking the question as to what is the state of the Arctic Ocean and how has that been changing, focusing in particular on the 2002 to 2017 time series. This is a sort of the classic example. You see, I don't know, can you see my cursor moving around here?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So, you see these long lines, for example, here of points. You see in the Bering Straits region, a lot of these dots, those are actually long-term moorings that, in particular, Rebecca Woodgate with the University of Washington has put out recently that have been in place for a long time, started in the 1980s. So these are long-term observations of Arctic change that tell us a number of things about how the Arctic Ocean system here in particular behaves over time. And so one outcome or one product from these findings is the recognition that over this time period from 2002 to 2017, the amount of heat that is stored in the Beaufort Sea, north of the Bering Straits region here, has increased more than twofold. And that is significant from a number of perspectives that we'll get into in a bit more detail later. But this is sort of a good example of how long-term observations are analyzed, reported. You'll notice here these bars underneath. This is based on a study by Marie-Louise Timmermans, who's looked at long-term mooring and other observational records as well, and just looked at specific time periods where she wasn't able to kind of tease out these finer scale variations. This is a classic example of how to look at long-term records of climate change. You can take it a step further. So I want to share this plot here that was generated by Igor Polyakov here at the International Arctic Research Center and his colleagues. And again, it relates to this question of what's the state of the Arctic Ocean. So Igor, based on a lot of data, not just the data I just shared here earlier, but data going back to the 1970s and earlier, has come up with this presentation, sort of a conceptual model of the Arctic Ocean, where he's comparing the period before roughly about 2007 in terms of what does the physical state of the Arctic Ocean look like? What do we have in the way of inflows? So from the left-hand side, you have the Pacific inflow through Bering Strait into the Chukchi Sea and then the deeper Amerasian Basin here. On the right-hand side would be the corresponding opening over on the Eurasian side, the Fram Strait. I just want to focus on the left part of the figure here. So what Igor and his colleagues have done is they've compared the state of the Arctic Ocean before 2007 and after 2007. And you notice, some of the things we extract from these long-term climate scale observations is the fact that both the amount of water entering into the Arctic Ocean from Bering Strait has increased, as well as the heat that it brings. So we started to build up as a result of a persistent atmospheric circulation system that's essentially piling fresh water up in particular in the Canada Basin, the Beaufort Gyre. We started to build up more fresh water here over time. There's been more heat put in there. The sea ice has gotten thinner. And of course, if you look on the right-hand side here, you see that a lot of these changes then come with changes in the marine ecosystems. So you have more of the zooplankton, the small shrimp and other animals move in. You see some of the communities living on the seafloor that are spreading into the north. And I'll briefly mention a bit more about what this has meant for salmon as well here. So these are all classic pictures of what can you extract from climate scale long-term observations. The question, of course, is, so how does any of this matter to people in the Bering Straits region? I'm sure some of you here on the call can tell me more about this than I'd ever be able to. But in some ways, you probably already recognize, right? Even in the time period of around 2007 to 2010, while people hadn't even analyzed this data, the Inupiat and the Yupik of the Bering Straits region were already reporting on significant changes in marine systems. So of course, a lot of these observations embedded in indigenous knowledge and traditional environmental knowledge keep track of a lot of these things in a holistic fashion. So not even separating the physical or the biological or some of the other elements of these changes. So that raises the question, well, what about observations that matter at the local scale? I do want to highlight one fact here, and that is that if you look at the data points that Dr. Nguyen and her colleagues analyzed, you look at the Bering Straits region, you'll notice that there's these white areas where data did not enter into this analysis of long-term climate change. And a lot of those areas are in the coastal regions or in Norton Sound, Kotzebue Sound. A lot of those areas that matter to coastal communities are not well covered by long-term observations. And that's not necessarily out of ill will. Part of it is that if you have a deep draft icebreaker, you just can't travel into some of these regions. But there's a range of other reasons for this as well. And I want to explore that a bit more in terms of how can we do better in the main part of this talk. I do want to, though, acknowledge, and I'm really happy to actually see him on the call here. This is a graphic that Rick Tolman has shared. This is an output from a long-term climate scale observational data set about the sea surface temperature, specifically the average sea surface temperature in the area 5 to 25 miles south of Nome. Annual averages here. And it is presented here in the form of the total number of days for a given year with the sea surface temperature above 10 degrees centigrade or around 50 Fahrenheit or so. And what you see here, which has much bigger relevance already for people in the Nome regions and Norton Sound, is that you see there's variability here, there's potentially periodic patterns or variations, but there's also a major increase in the number of days where the sea surface temperature has exceeded 10 centigrade, with these recent years where you're even crossing the 100-day threshold. And so those types of observations have direct implications, and in particular, if we were able to better predict those at the scale that matters to local communities, that of course would also be important in the context of dealing with various marine processes that matter to coastal communities. So then let's just briefly think about what is it that I'd like to talk about today. You know, what is this presentation about? The question I'm interested in, and I'm not going to be able to give you an answer on this, but I do want to show sort of different directions that we can all collaborate on to make progress, is how long-term observations of Arctic marine environments can best benefit indigenous peoples of the region, as well as the communities in the Arctic at the local scale. The point I'm trying to make is that this international collaboration that I'll explain a bit more about has the acronym Arctic Roads, or the Roadmap for Arctic Observing Data Systems, tries to take aim at this goal, but as I've pointed out here, it's a lofty goal. It's not something that's straightforward. And so again, a lot there for us to learn and improve on. And then I also try to, at least as best as I can, not being from the region, but try to see what might this mean in terms of, you know, how do we improve observations? What are some of the challenges? What might that mean for the Bering Strait region? So let's first just quickly take a look at this acronym here, SAON Roads. What does that actually refer to? Just a few slides. And the motivation here is, again, this question of how can we do better? How can we, you know, you see the photo here. This is the person on the right is Billy Adams from Utqiagvik, outstanding sea ice and environmental indigenous scientist and scholar working with North Slope Borough, Department of Wildlife Management, but also part of the Alaska Arctic Observatory Knowledge Hub that Donna Hauser is coordinating. So Billy is somebody who both knows how to conduct observations using scientific instrumentation. He's deploying a CTD, conductivity temperature depth sensor here, but he also has a very deep understanding of the environment through the lens of indigenous knowledge, traditional environmental knowledge. So my sense is, having worked with Billy and others, in particular on the North Slope for a while, the sense is that the long-term data we're collecting are not serving people in coastal communities in Alaska or other parts of the Arctic, in particular indigenous peoples, well. They could be serving them much better. Some of them are translated into data products that people use in these communities, but again, you know, maybe something we can talk about towards the end of the talk when we have time for discussion. So, but it's clear that those long-term observations can provide benefits, but the question is, how do we do better in you know, coming through on that promise? And that's where part of the challenge is that there's not enough collaboration at different scales, and in particular, meaningful collaboration, ideally in a co-production form between indigenous communities and scientists working with universities or agencies or other organizations. This initiative, called the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks Initiative, or SAON for short, was set up about 15 years ago under the Arctic Council, so all of the Arctic coastal states, a few others, as well as under the International Arctic Science Committee, which includes several dozen of non-Arctic states as well. And the SAON initiative has developed a vision, increasingly with direct input and involvement by indigenous peoples, for a connected, collaborative, and comprehensive long-term observing system that serves societal needs, and in particular, equitably involves Arctic indigenous peoples in helping provide observations that are meaningful in a decision-making and planning context. But again, so far that's mostly a vision. How do you go from a vision to a specific action? That's something I want to touch on a bit more. So again, here's just a brief reminder, the two acronyms, SAON, Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, Joint Initiative Arctic Council, and IASC. And then to put these lofty goals into action, the SAON group developed a roadmap for Arctic observing and data systems, or Arctic roads for short, that is meant to help build partnerships and create well-defined plans on how to move forward on some of these challenges. There's 4 elements to the SAON roads or Arctic roads effort that are important, focused very much on equitable partnerships with indigenous peoples, including providing sufficient funding support. There's the recognition that benefits have to be derived, shared benefits from the process. There has to be a there has to be some kind of complementary benefit by bringing global, regional, local observing perspectives together, and this roads process should be incremental, should be flexible, collaborative, and evolve and adapt to some of the rapid changes we're seeing. And it should also allow for grassroots involvement, which again matters in a place like the Bering Straits region, where, you know, Gay, you pointed this out, people have a much better understanding in the region about what's important, what's all going on, than, you know, somebody like myself sitting in Fairbanks or somebody sitting down the lower 48. You know, that's why, as you mentioned, Gay, earlier on, people are coming into your region to talk directly with the people on the ground or on the water who know. And somehow the roads process is meant to incorporate that as well. So, of course, again, you could say, well, these are all nice and lofty goals. Like, how do you actually put this into action? That's very difficult. And I'm not claiming that. Certainly, I don't have all the answers or even know how to get to a point where you're able to reap some of those tangible benefits, but it's something that a lot of people are now putting effort and thought into. So now let's spend a bit of time and I just want to illustrate how this might work. And I want to use a specific example here, the example of salmon as a shared Arctic variable. So I'll talk a bit more about what do we mean by these shared Arctic variables, and then I'll build on a lot of the work that some of the members of the Indigenous Liaison team, who are part of the project that I'm part of as well, specifically Craig Cheithluk, Harmony Weiner, Margaret Rudolph, have been working on to sort of get some actionable pieces into motion, moving towards a salmon expert panel. So the SAON roads process builds on this idea that, you know, in the past, I've mentioned this earlier, right? The map I showed at the very start of the talk, all these dots showing ocean measurements, that was driven entirely by global and regional ocean observing networks, people working at universities or with agencies, with very little, if any, direct thoughts to how might this relate to what people in coastal communities are involved in, let alone direct involvement by indigenous peoples in designing these observations. So what the roads process is trying to do is link the kind of this global large-scale approach with a bottom-up approach at the community level that is indigenous-led, that clearly delineates what are the priorities for observations relevant in decision-making planning contexts, and how do you then put those into action? And ideally, the idea is then to also, by building up from these individual local places, to also involve regional entities. You know, these might be, you know, something on the scale of, if you think about your region, you know, Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission as it pertains to bowhead whales, you know, some of the co-management bodies, but also regional bodies that may be related to concerns voiced by tribal consortia COERIC, of course, is very active. Vera Metcalf, as executive director of the Eskimo Walrus Commission, of course, is a great example for somebody who's been working at the intersection of these local, pan-Arctic or global and regional scale concerns. And so the idea of a shared Arctic variable is that it's a number of different observations under a broader umbrella. So you can, you can think of it as a process or a phenomenon. In our case, I want to focus on salmon. So what all connects salmon to these three different realms here, and how do you have to make observations to actually generate benefits that are relevant in different ways to these three different spheres? That's one element of or one goal that the Rhodes process is meant to achieve. Now I'm getting out of my depth. Like, I'm not a salmon scientist. As I mentioned, my interest is in sea ice, but I wanted to share here just a brief reminder, which of course you're all aware of. In an observing context, salmon is important from a marine ecosystems, but also food security perspective. We see large changes in the Bering Sea, the Chukchi Sea, other parts of the Arctic Ocean, translates directly into food security concerns. And of course, for indigenous peoples, those often are tied to food sovereignty concerns, and they hence result in sometimes very contentious discussions about regional policy and local response. If you followed some of the conversations around the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council and their discussions about how to address bycatch of salmon as part of the ground fishery, those are the types of questions where you're in a very, very contentious landscape where it is both important but also difficult to make sure that information is available to people in communities in the region, as well as at a larger scale, to help find ideally common ground or help find equitable solutions towards management of, in this case, for example, salmon stocks. One important aspect, which I'm sure most of you are aware, but the Bering Sea is the mingling ground of salmon originating from Alaska all the way over into Canada, Chukotka and other parts of Russia, Kamchatka, and Eastern Asia. And in particular, Japan has seen a major decline in their chum, most of them coming out of northern Hokkaido or out of Hokkaido, northern Honshu, and the vast majority of those being hatchery fish. This raises a question about competition for resources in the Bering Sea. So there's a lot of important questions that again relate to the need for observations that are relevant here. But of course, a key point is that, again, beautiful graphic here put together by Rick Tolman for the Bering Sea Science Report that Laura Pruitt and Heather McFarland put together, showing here the warming of the Bering Sea surface waters over this past century or so. So the climate change angle here is very important. And of course, if you followed this in the media, Anchorage Daily News had a very significant, impactful series on this. The fact that the people of the lower, middle, upper Yukon River, Tanana River tributaries, all the way over into Canada, were not able to harvest fish for either subsistence or commercial purposes for the past several years. Major concern, of course. You see here this photo: salmon who haven't even spawned out, dead in the lower reaches of the rivers, where again elevated temperatures are just one factor. So this realm here is an area where the team that I'm part of, by collaborating with an international working group, the Indigenous Food Security Working Group, and a smaller subset here in Alaska of the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Working Group, through that collaboration, we've taken guidance from them to recognize that salmon is one area where a shared Arctic variable concept would result in significant benefits in terms of being put into place. And the question then is, again, brings us back to observations, local context, this question of where else do observations need to be made and of what? Those are the types of questions that this group working through the Rhodes process is trying to address. I do want to also, though, acknowledge that, of course, there's a lot of work going on salmon, so we're not at all trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to bring together different pieces or support efforts in ways that connect the long-term observing needs to the priorities that are being defined by different groups in the region. But in terms of observations, I do want to be sure that, to reference some of the work that's being done by community-driven or community-based observing networks. The example here is the Alaska Arctic Observatory and Knowledge Hub, which involves all of these communities here north of Bering Strait with observers and activities. There's a steering group member in Nome, Austin Masuk, and we also have a number of observers here, in particular on the North Slope. The reason this is interesting is that Elizabeth Mickok-Lindley, a graduate student at UAF, focuses on salmon, and in particular the spread of salmon into the Arctic Ocean, Chukchi, Beaufort Sea. She was part of a team that showed very clear evidence that salmon are spawning on North Slope rivers, and she hosted a workshop here in winter of this year, this past winter, where she brought together a bunch of indigenous observer or experts, salmon scientists, fisheries biologists, to look at this in a bit more detail. So these types of efforts clearly have to play an important role if we think about long-term observations relevant to salmon. So again, just a reminder here, the shared variable framework. So what I'd like to also highlight is that, and this is something that our group that I'm part of learned, that it takes time to build relationships, trust, fully understand the degree of inequities that exist with regards to observations that may or may not serve local communities, some of the underlying challenges in terms of, for example, access to salmon as a resource. I already mentioned some of that. It takes time to build a team that has educated themselves to a level that they're actually able to engage, in particular if they come from the university. And I appreciate, Gay, in particular, all the hard work you're doing through the Sea Grant program, and just you personally in the region as somebody who really does everything humanly possible, right, to make sure that people who want to work in the region, in the Bering Straits region, understand that no, you got to do some homework before you come here, and that is important if you want to have an impact with your work. And so this graphic here was put together by Margaret Rudolph, a postdoc now who's working with us on this project, where she's identified sort of the various methods or approaches or aspects of research that matter in the context of Arctic variables, Arctic shared variables, including cultural inclusivity, ethics, but also the different methods that are being employed, as well as co-production of knowledge, importance of infrastructure. And she's also identified the different groups of people, organizations that ideally would be part of such an effort. So it's as much about building a community of practice here as it is about coming up with very specific guidance on long-term observations. I also want to acknowledge, Julie Raymond-Yakubian, along with Rochelle Daniel, Carolina Behe, as a group that recognizes also the contribution of indigenous knowledge to their work by referencing Hlamyua, a concept out of Yupik worldviews, have done a great service to the broader research community by laying out a framework for indigenous co-production of knowledge, where, in this conceptual diagram here, you see sort of the different tools that are part of, or processes that are part of approaching or moving towards co-production of knowledge, as well as different kind of action elements where you actually have to work on things. So this in part is informing our work as well. it's a recognition that this is a longer process. That the project I'm part of is definitely not claiming that we're currently working in co-production mode, but we're working towards that. So the final thing I want to do is, before closing out here, is just give you a brief glimpse of where's this headed and how can you be involved if you're interested. So here's a more technical description of the process of how around the concept of a shared Arctic variable of salmon, the idea is to stand up an expert panel starting at the community scale. So this is work that Fred Scheithlook and Harmony Weiner have been leading, bringing together a core group of experts that's then kind of build circles outward to identify, kind of define the scope, purpose, gaps, and benefits of observations around the broader theme of salmon. The assessment of benefits is going to be very important. This is something that Margaret Rudolph is also working on, because it can't just boil down to socioeconomic benefits or economic benefits that are currently part of a lot of the fisheries approaches. I mean, NOAA as an agency has done quite a bit to think more about other aspects of benefits related to well-being at the community or individual or family household scale. And increasingly, there is recognition that you have to involve social scientists, indigenous knowledge holders. And it's great to see, we haven't met personally, but I see Mabel Baldwin-Schaefer here as part of our group. It's great to see people like Ms. Baldwin-Schaefer engage in this space, working through and with the agency. That's clearly very important. So ideally, at the very end of this work that these expert panels, in our case, the example would be salmon, come up with, is to develop an actual strategy where you have a very clear plan that's been defined by communities at the local scale, but that has buy-in from agencies and groups all the way up to the global or pan-Arctic level, where there's agreement. Here's the priorities of observations we need to make to ensure that these long-term observations benefit groups at the local scale, indigenous communities, up to the regional, up to the pan-Arctic, or potentially global. So the group that I'm part of, I'll just put this up here briefly, is a so-called research networking activity. We're funded by largely National Science Foundation, but also strong support from NOAA. And we're bringing other partners into the fold that are contributing to this. We've got a number of different teams set up. This is a group that involves around 10 different institutions here in the US. We have international partnerships. We've learned a lot of lessons over the past couple of years through this project. And I want to acknowledge in particular the Indigenous Liaison Team. Current members, past members include Victoria Bushman, who's now working as a senior advisor for Inuit Circumpolar Council Greenland, and others, to help us work through, in particular with the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Working Group, how can, again, this question, how can we do better in terms of these long-term observations? Please visit our website if you want to know more. I just want to focus on the salmon piece, and Rick Toman in the pre-presentation banter referenced the Arctic Report Card. He's one of the co-editors, was leading the panel during the NOAA Arctic Report Card release. This is a figure from a really nice essay that was led by Eric Shane here at International Arctic Research Center with a number of others across the university and outside, kind of summarizing some of the complex and complicated situation about salmon in the Bristol Bay region, Yukon, Kuskokwim watershed, and elsewhere. This is part of the foundational information that's important. The plan now is for Harmony Weiner, one of our Indigenous Liaison Team members shown here at left, and Craig Scheithlook at right, to put together a workshop for the next Alaska Forum on the Environment, Friday, February 9, 2024, building on a preparatory workshop that our project hosted earlier this year in February at AFE. Building on this, you see some of the folks here from the Kotzebue region as well. Bobby Schaefer, for example, was really a great member of this group here. Brooke Woods from Interior Alaska, several others you see now here. Kathy Kuhn, currently with NOAA, formerly with Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We're part of this group. So really building on this kind of growing a network of people who have a common vision, realize the need for this type of work. In February, 9th of February, we'll come together again at AFE, and I'd very much encourage those of you who are interested in this work to join us. I think it'll be a really interesting meeting where it's going to get more down to actually working on some of the details. Looking at the clock here, I just want to share a few slides here. This question that is important, of course. Well, if you're doing all this work, how are people going to be able to both participate and learn about it, or both individually contribute and then benefit from it? That's definitely a challenge, and we're fortunate to have Matt Jones, who's director of the Arctic Data Center, that's supported through the National Science Foundation. He's a member of our team. He's also been part of the leadership of the International Year of the Salmon project, and he, with a number of other folks, is actually working on this question of what would a data portal or an information portal look like that serves the needs of communities in the region. So that's work that's underway. But I feel that the CS4 Walrus Outlook, which is focused on the Bering Straits region here, is a good example of some of the things that you may have to consider as you do this. So CS4 Walrus Outlook, SciWo, again, I want to recognize Vera Metcalf as the executive director of the Eskimo Walrus Commission, one of the key partners of this effort here. She was really instrumental in both challenging the broader community and leading us in moving towards this collaboration between the National Weather Service, Alaska Ocean Observing System, IARC National Research Center, as well as under the great organizational leadership of the U.S. Arctic, the Arctic Research Consortium of the U.S. Lisa Sheffield Guy, in particular, has been really instrumental here. But most important, observers from all of these communities are represented by dots, contributing during the walrus hunting season, observations from the community that are then melded with improved, focused weather service forecasts and information products for the region, relevant from a marine safety and community safety perspective. If you don't know what the SciWo is about, I encourage you to visit the website. Here's some photos taken by Curtis Naukpuk from Shishmaref. He's been a great supporter over the years. He also really exemplifies somebody who's deeply steeped in indigenous and traditional environmental knowledge, but who also is a really savvy user of satellite data products. He knows he's able to pull up satellite data from places where I would never even care to look, let alone find something. So just want to acknowledge just how important these and other observers, Marcus Barr from Brevik, Bugles Johns from Nome, and others, really key in making this project a success. And in particular, just a few weeks ago, Nathan Kettle, Amy Hendricks, who is on the call here as well, part of her PhD work, published a great paper in Polar Geography where they did an assessment of SciWo, like how effective is it? And I don't want to go into much detail. They highlighted a number of points that are important here, in particular emphasis by the different community members, the importance of using native languages to describe the sea ice and other weather terms, finding ways to include youth meaningfully in the project, potentially by having them be involved in translating National Weather Service forecasts into indigenous languages. Those are really important points or aspects of this collaboration. Again, this is a figure from the paper here. I just want to highlight that surveying the contributors and members of the community, the value of the information that the SciWo provides is recognized in terms of the different information products here provided by Weather Service or others, but also very much so concerned about accuracy. I mean, the people who are providing the observations, the people in the communities who are using them, are experts whose knowledge and understanding of the environment is so much more refined and nuanced than anything that say somebody like myself or a weather service employee who's looking at the region as a whole could provide. So that's the important aspect of this partnership. And it's exciting to hear that now Nathan and Don Moore out of Anchorage with the National Weather Service, who's working on improving information services for the Weather Service, are now collaborating with a number of different people in Utqiagvik, Kotzebue, and other communities to improve, really get down to the nitty-gritty of how can this community feedback make observing products more relevant. And I see the same approach as being potentially of value for these long-term climate observations. So just a few thoughts. Thanks for bearing with me here. A few thoughts, again, just from my personal perspective. I haven't spent nearly as much time as I'd like to in the Nome and Bering Straits region, so I can't, of course, I don't know what are the most pressing issues, but just a few reflections to close us out here. So again, starting with this graphic that Rick provided here, I know you, Gay, and others have emphasized the risks associated with potential occurrence of harmful algal blooms, which are tied to these extended periods of summer warmth in the ocean, allowing some of the algal cysts that are sitting in the sediment to release the actual potential cells that then produce toxins. Well, what do we do about that in the context of long-term observing? Japan is currently planning and starting to build a new ice-breaking Arctic research vessel. This is a schematic here. They hosted a workshop last month, November, in Tokyo, where the question was, how can Japan make such a vessel a platform that is of potential value to the broader research community and a platform for international collaboration? And they started to incorporate input from indigenous communities as well. Representative Hannah Marie Garcia, working for the Indigenous Sentinels Network with the Aleut community of St. Paul Island, was at the meeting, gave a really powerful and very deep perspective on what it means to have such a vessel work in regions that are important to indigenous peoples here in the Bering Sea and other areas. So Japan, as a non-Arctic country, is starting to think about how can we benefit through these long-term observations that this vessel is going to make over the years. And one of the things that struck me was in that context, and this is actually a photo from the Nome Nugget this August, was something I learned about in the context of a meeting, that these automated so-called flow cytobots, so these are able to look at individual cells that are being sucked in through the vessel's seawater intake. Now image processing, artificial intelligence has gotten to the point where individual cells can be identified and can give you an indication as to whether some of these harmful algal species are actually present. This is work that Don Anderson at Woods Hole has been leading for quite a while. And shown here is a map from a paper in 2022 that shows these high concentrations of algal cysts, so the precursors to these hazardous algal species. And as I understand it, but again, that's something that you here on the call probably know much more about, there was some communication, this was on the Sikuliaq this year, there was some communication between Sikuliaq and coastal communities about, hey, we're finding these high concentrations of these cysts and algae, how that may be a potential topic of concern. I see a lot of potential for deepening those types of connections, making them more formal so that there's a formal advisory that can be given to people in the region, and having not just one research vessel, but ideally many of them implement this system on board, have it run as an underway system so that such data can be collected routinely as a side benefit for a lot of these cruises. And I think the only other thing I want to point to real quickly, and then I'll stop, is other connection here for the Nome region. There's a lot of the marine mammals that come through the region, migrate up into the higher Arctic here. The Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement is an important framework that explicitly calls for involvement of Indigenous and permanent Arctic Council participant involvement, and creates an opening to link concerns and priorities here in the region to the high Arctic. So again, something that may be, or I'm sure people in the region, particularly those working with COERC and other bodies, have already thought about, but something that may also help the research community be more effective in working with people in the region. Thanks for sticking with me. I'm sorry for going a bit longer than I anticipated, but be happy to take questions, chat more.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, Hajo. And as the Straight Science audience knows, because it's never easy, we say thank you first, and then it's never easy being a public speaker. This is the time that while you're forming your questions, I see you, Sue. While you're forming your questions, give a little love to Hajo Eicken in the chat box. Never easy being a speaker. Never easy being a speaker on the darkest day of the year, and he pulled it off, and we've all learned something new here. So thank you very much, and Sue Moore, take it away.
Well, thank you, Gay, but thank you, Hajo. You know, great presentation. Nice to see you again virtually, if that's the way we have to do it. But a couple of things I just wanted to mention. I was really happy to see your focus on salmon, but a little bit distressed not to see in your maps about observations any mention of the Distributed Biological Observatory, which we've been running, of course, since 2010, from basically south of St. Lawrence Island all the way through the Chukchi Sea, where there's a lot of biological observations that are very integral to the Seon activity. And so that was surprising to me that wasn't part of your presentation. And also that marine mammals and actually underwater sound are part of the essential ocean variables of the Global Ocean Observatory. So these elements are not missing. They are there and ready to go, as much as any of our data are ready to go, if you know what I mean. But the other thing is we've had long-term observations of marine mammals with local communities through Department of Wildlife, as you know, belugas, bowheads. Those animals can tell us how the ecosystems are changing, and one of the things that I continue to try to work for as now a commissioner of the Marine Mammal Commission is to include marine mammals in observatories like Seon, and I still don't see it, Hajo. So as much as I regard you highly and very happy to see your presentation, a little bit disappointed that I don't see a broader coverage of what is happening and has been going on for a long time.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate the call out, Sue. And no, those are good points. I mean, partly it's just me being negligent in not pointing this out. I mean, the DBO lines were, for example, represented in the plot I showed of N. Wynn's work, and is, you know, collaboration with DBO scientists is very much part of the effort. You know, that was part of the meeting in Japan as well. Pacific Arctic Group is a group that brings together, as you well know, these different groups. A lot of that work, I think the only other, so that was just negligence on my part, you know, and I don't want to give the impression that DBO in particular hasn't already been doing a lot of work in terms of identifying a set of observations, identifying a region where those observations are being made. I think where the Seon Roads effort comes in is to do even more work to connect that with coastal communities' needs and drill down a bit further on what are the highest priorities that can be observed. The other point that you raise is a really good one in terms of the essential variables under global ocean observing frameworks. So as part of this effort that I'm part of, there is a significant push now underway to better combine the global ocean observing framework and Arctic regional observations and local observations. And that's an effort that Craig Lee, Molly McCammon are leading here in the US. It's the co-lead is Jari Haapala with the Finnish Meteorological Institute. So I see some of the concern that you rightly voice, Sue, being folded into those conversations. And those are not easy because the global ocean observing crowd has their way of doing things, and you know, some of the Arctic researchers have their way of doing things. But my sense is that's where a lot of this is going to come together. Thanks.
Yeah, if I could just follow up real quickly, I appreciate that, but I just think that we've come further than perhaps some of the SEAN work reflects. And I'll put my hand down now, but one other thing I wanted to say about the SeaWo effort is, you know, Jim Overland was a big part of that. We were sitting down with Vera and others at a meeting in Miami, Florida, of all places, to begin the SeaWo effort in 2010. And really a big part of that was Jim Overland wanting to make the sea ice data more reflective of the region. And so just wanted to give a shout out to Jim. Thank you, Hajo. Nice presentation.
Yeah, no, kudos. I mean, yeah, I should have mentioned Jim, PMEL, Pacific Marine Environmental Lab. You know, your home institution, Sue, was critical in that context as well, for sure. Yes.
And okay, Sue's got her hand down. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Hajo. Mabel, one sec, because I wanted to add in, Sue, when you brought up marine mammals, and maybe this is a question for Hajo. In my, you know, my little wheels are kind of trying to go around like a hamster in there. But for marine resources that are typically, for the most part, federally managed, there is state management. For citizenry, all along, not just our coast of the Bering Strait, but on the Chukotkin coast, they have their own ways of doing things. But how does, how do you take into account in this observing network and throwing information or asking people to report information? How do you take in, we have mandatory federal and state reporting obligations. Is that, are you in this sands, roads that, is this for like sea ice observations, which doesn't have any kind of federal management, water temperatures and all those physical science things don't have the citizenry, we don't have any reporting obligations. We don't have to sign up. We don't have to say this or that, or tag this or that, or help at co-management. There's no co-management of ice, you know, that kind of thing. Does it matter in your group whether you are getting information that is on physical science, or would it be working with the entities who are already in a management, co-management, in the case of marine mammals, co-management situation? Or are you asking the citizenry?
Yeah, great question. So I think, I mean, and this is helpful because I may not.
You're next.
I haven't framed this well enough because I think it also gets partly at what you're asking, Sue, right? So I just want to make sure that I make it clear. SEAN, Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, is an initiative under the Arctic Council and IASC. The SEAN board chair is Sandy Starkweather, who's the executive director of the Arctic Ocean, the Arctic Observing Network, right? She is a NOAA affiliate. She is also leading the interagency effort under the Interagency Arctic Research Planning Committee that brings together the different observing arms. So everything you mentioned, Gay, as well as you, Sue, right? All of those efforts, whether it's DBO, whether it's observations that filter through the co-management bodies, whether it's the Global Ocean Monitoring Observing Network, you know, a range of other things, those are all subsumed. And I think the recognition, of course, I can't speak for the agencies, but we have under Sandy's leadership, had a number of gatherings and processes that have had agency involvement to see how these different components can be put together into a more robust observing effort where exactly what I think you're getting at, Gay, is possible, such that a combination of community-driven observations, whether it's North Slope Borough doing their work in terms of bowhead whale censuses, citizen science, protected species observers on vessels, including foreign vessels going through the region, remote sensing data, all of that ends up in a more coherent framework so that you make the best of all the available data. So there's no distinction in terms of, oh, if it's citizen science, it can't be involved. Part of the process and part of the goal is that by very clearly defining the requirements of observations that are needed to achieve a particular benefit. So let's say, you want to use observations of bowhead whales to drive, federal or international policy, then of course, you can't have an error bar of plus minus 5,000 whales, right? Because that's a bit too big. So you gotta be clear about how accurate do these observations have to be? Where do they have to be made? All of that ideally is folded into this concept of having a shared Arctic variable under which it's made clear, if you want to contribute to these observations, here's the requirements that you have to meet. And this is a standard process that, both agency-led or research programs have to go through to ensure that observations are actually helpful in answering specific questions.
All right. Thank you so much. Mabel Baldwin and then Rick. Go ahead, Mabel.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my name was mentioned earlier. I'm Mabel Baldwin Schaefer. I was born and raised in Northwest Arctic, Alaska. I hold a science background. I am currently working for Alaska Fisheries Science Center as a tribal research coordinator. And I have joined the team to help lead efforts in building partnerships in rural communities and to identify areas where we at NOAA can better serve our communities in Alaska, such as projects that are relevant to them. If you need my contact, Gay, I believe you have it, and you can grab that from her. All else, I think that's it. Mostly, how could we improve science and management for sustainable fisheries and protected resources and marine ecosystems to better serve communities? And how could we get those types of information to our public? Thank you.
Thank you, Mabel.
Thanks, Gay.
You bet. All right. Your hand is still up, Mabel, so I'm just so you know. And Rick, you had your hand up, but it's down. I don't know if that was just a rethink or you got your answer.
Nope, I thought you were going to call on me, so
Yes,
I
you're
didn't want to
next.
forget.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation, Hajo. Great overview. Just wanted to maybe put a plug in one of your early slides there. You showed the big map and where all this work is going on, and you pointed out that there is overall a lack of observations in that shallow waters near coastal areas, which are so critical to so many facets of life in coastal Alaska. And so I just want to put a plug in for anything we can do to increase that very near shore. I know it's harder to work in those areas than in the deeper water, but just because it's harder to do doesn't make it any less important. And that, I'm of course a climate person, but even on the physical science side, satellite derived sea surface temperatures are great, but they struggle in the near coastline environment, and we've got some big issues with that. But that's where a lot of the action is that's affecting people. So anything we can do to increase the ocean observations, physical, biological, right in that near coastal zone, I think would benefit a lot of people, benefit the science, benefit communities, benefit people living and working and getting dinner from the ocean. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Rick. Anything you want to say to that, Hajo, or you're good?
No, I mean, I appreciate both
Okay.
Rick's and Mabel Baldwin Schaefer's comments. Thanks. And maybe Seth can probably tell us much more about that anyway. So.
All right. Well, there you go, Seth. You're up, and followed by Sue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good
And
to
thank
see you.
you for presentation, Hajo. So, you know, that your comment about the lack of observations in the nearshore had also stuck out to me during the presentation. And some of the thoughts going around in my head at that time were, how many observations are enough? And do we really need to get researchers into coastal areas to make some observations, knowing that these are particularly sensitive areas? They're areas where research can be particularly disruptive to hunting activities. And we do have both remote sensing, and we've got some really, really good models these days. And so I think that just tempering the notion that because we have some gaps, we need to go out and make some more measurements for the sake of filling in those gaps. We need to get better justifications for making those measurements, because maybe we've got the tools already to understand how the system itself is working, and that's the key thing. As you pointed out, there are long-term observations represented on that map at the DBO locations. Certainly, I'm never one to turn down observations. I love having a lot more of them, but I think we also have to do it with all due care. And then the second thing that I just wanted to mention is that we had a workshop on resilience of the Yukon River salmon. I can't remember when it was, maybe back in 2015 or 2016, when Eddie Carmack was a chair at UAF. And we came out with a 8-page glossy report from that provided a lot of specific recommendations for research for sustainability of salmon. And if you're not aware of that report, I'd be happy to send a copy of that to you. In fact, I've got a box of about 50 of them still in my office, but we've got it electronically as well, and be happy to distribute that if it would be useful to your upcoming meeting.
Great, thanks, Seth. Yeah, on the latter part, you know, I mean, it's people like Eric Shane and others, you know, Peter Westley and colleagues who are really focusing on sort of the salmon piece. But if you can share that with me, though, I'd appreciate that. Getting back to your prior point, though, I hear you, but at the same time, I would like to push back a bit, because I was part of an effort where the Northwest Arctic Bureau a few years ago looked at what are the research needs in the region. The top priority, there were two. One was Western Alaska caribou herd. The other one was ecosystem of Kotzebue Sound, marine ecosystem of Kotzebue Sound. And, you know, that's one of those areas where there isn't a lot of observations. And they made it very clear that that is a top priority, is to get better data on the ecosystem of Kotzebue Sound in relation to beluga, other species that are important to harvest. So my sense is that, yes, you know, what you're pointing out is combination of remote sensing data, autonomous sensor system models is important, but ultimately it's also putting instruments, or, you know, just having direct observations from people in the region to look at where observations important to them. You know, that's where I feel like the AOK team has made some progress, because that's, you know, people like Bobby Schaefer and others going out on the ice, observing, you know, say under ice warm water pools, under ice blooms, you know, algal blooms that relate to processes where I feel there's still a strong argument to be made, in particular for community-driven and community kind of designed measurements in those areas.
So I'm gonna, Seth, he makes me want to think of saying something. You
No,
want,
that's great. That's great. Thanks.
all right.
I agree that it has to be done with appropriate consultation of the people living in those areas and hopefully their participation as well, but not just to fill gaps.
And yep, Sue, I see. I just got to say one thing before I forget it, because there's a lot always on the background here. So when you're saying Hajo, the nearshore communities, you probably aren't aware, and you did have a picture of the IFCB, the Imaging Flow Cytobot, that was acutely important in warning this region of a harmful algal bloom. And one thing, you probably aren't aware of the community response to this issue regionally, and that is, I won't get into it, but it is something you probably want to hear about at some point, because it's the region taking care of itself and working with the science community. But it's a real beautiful, it's not done by any means, but it's a regional response with our neighbors as well. But one of the things I saw that Jamstack ship or something, one of the things that terrifies us now, because this issue isn't going away with harmful algal blooms, is how do we know? Because we're relying on researchers who are experts to do a study. But one of the things that we found in 2023, but we only had one ship, it happened to be Sikuliak, that had this magic machine on it. They are expensive. But even though it wasn't doing a research project, it was a tool to alert us to a problem that is a human health, food security, conservation concern, economic problem, so forth and so on. Can we reverse this for just that? And when you're thinking about, you want the nearshore, how does science go to the nearshore? How would science work if, in the case of something like a harmful algal bloom, all the research vessels have a mandatory IFCB? All research vessels plug into when they hit a threshold, or somebody's watching from afar. I won't get into, I can do that later with you in person, but if the ship lights off this piece of equipment that doesn't even have anybody on board, it's so automated, and it lights off and it hits into a hub, we were ready for 2023 and we got word, and then a whole bunch of people up and down the coast were alerted from within the region statewide. Is that something where the science, you don't actually have to have a project, but the science is hooked in with like what is the Bering Strait healthcare and community response that is driven by the regional hub and the state healthcare response world? So that would be the opposite. That would be the science. Without hesitate, like, we need that piece of equipment, whatever you guys are seeing. And we need to have the immediacy of communications to know that, oh, geez, if we have a problem in the Bering Strait, everybody will put the word out and everybody get going. Is that's opposite kind of what you were saying, Seth, but that my world is usually my perspectives are usually opposite, but not really opposite, but using the ships, using the science world, not as necessarily you have to have a big research and but come more of a service to coastal communities up and down who are organizing themselves and the state correctly, in ways that benefit the communication network that's already in play. Just a thought. Doesn't need a response.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, and you put it much better than I did. Again, I was too brief and didn't explain it well. I mean, that was the point I was making, right? Because, I mean, Japan has demonstrated with their current vessel, the Mirai, that the routine launches of radio sounds from the vessel that they do operationally that directly report into the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization network, improve weather forecasts in Alaska for Alaskans. So having the same approach, just as you've discussed, for other types of observations that are routinely part of the vessel inventory, that's the way to go. I agree. And that's where I see, particularly Japan taking the step and inviting people to come in and say, hey, how can we do better is a great way in that direction.
And the regions and the state response for healthcare regionally and statewide you know, and community and research are all entangled together, working well as a team up and down the coast, and that is driven by the regional response. Anyway, just something to think about. Thank you for being patient, Sue. Thank you, Hajo, for answering or thinking on that. Go ahead, Sue.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Very quickly, I know we're way over time.
It's all right. It's all right. In the Bering Strait region.
Comment is, I would just say the AHAB, Alaska Ocean Observing System, moving forward on HABs, moving forward on getting communication out. I'm not saying they are the total answer, but it's happening and people are talking in that regional way. Just another shout out for the DBO. I'm really not sent by Jackie Grebmeyer. It's just me telling you that there are coastal observations since a long time ago, but the DBO starting in 2010, all the way to the coast in DBO 3, which comes off of Point Hope, which is important to the Kotzebue community because of the beluga situation. Just discussed in depth at the Alaska Beluga Whaling Committee meeting in December. So all of these things are moving ahead, and what I think we're all struggling with is getting that communication out. Donna Hauser is a part of this information flow, and you know, others. We have other DBO lines going into the coast, DBO 5 going across Barrow Canyon and to the coast, where we're seeing a shift in distribution in gray whales in that case, and probably because there's more krill in the system. So I have to stop myself, but I'm just saying we have observations, fine scale into the coast, which we can incorporate in these larger SAON efforts, but I don't see that happening. That's why I'm on the call.
All right, and it's in the chat too. Thank you, Sue. Thoughts, Hajo, or?
No, I think those are great points. I mean, I think that's
right.
what's being worked on. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Hajo. And Mabel.
Thank you, Sue. I wanted to piggyback off of her comments about communication efforts. Based on type of information that we gather, I want to encourage our scientists to bring the data back to their regions to have them look it over in a meaningful way. Does that make sense? Before we try to disseminate any other information beyond who it already has been shared with. Thank you.
Thank you, Mabel.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great comment, actually, because I guess what I'm hearing is, you know, actually having a review, you know, just as what you would get reviewed when you publish a paper, having the community review, I think can be really helpful, both in terms of assessing the value of the data as well as the quality and the relevance. So that's a great comment. I appreciate it.
Yep, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Hajo and Mabel. Dean Stockwell, your hand is up. You have the floor.
Hajo, thank you very much for the talk. Really appreciated it. The system is changing. You've stated that. How do communities move from traditional harvesting to the new system? They have to adapt. You have to understand that all the communities that you mentioned kind of in Western and Northern Alaska aren't the same. They don't have the same dependency on animals. We have a loss of caribou herds, as you mentioned. We have a loss of salmon, primarily the king salmon in the Yukon, due to ichthyophonus. Ichthyophonus is a big thing in the Bering Sea, but nobody's really studying that. We have an increase of new fish predators with increased warming moving north. We have Pacific cod, we have pollock, all moving north. And these are all changing dynamics. Your very clear plan that you mentioned needs to have a bit of flexibility with communities, with community involvement, saying what are their primary interests. Utqiagvik, Point Hope, Nome, St. Lawrence, Shaktoolik, Kotzebue, as you mentioned, all have different priorities. Kotzebue has recently established a nice mooring system there. So the long-term data inshore in Kotzebue is being collected, but the communities have to expect change, and they have to be flexible, and they have to figure out where they're going from there. And all I'm saying is you've done a great job, but make sure all of these issues are brought up in meetings. The science is important, but community demands are also important. So thank you for your talk.
Right. Thanks, Dean.
All right, thank you, Dean. All right. I have a last question on my end, so I better ask it. And that is, if you live in the Bering Strait, everything's transboundary. It's one heck of a shared waterway when you get this tight. We just plumb run out of land. We're run out of water. There's so much land. We run out of water. So the salmon, marine mammals, harmful algal bloom, and what I'm afraid we may see up here this summer would be avian influenza in the marine mammals, and it is on the move, and it is changing potentially in its delivery methods, which may make it more difficult to not have it spread quicker. But transboundary, UAF, how exciting. International Arctic Research Center. If you live in the Bering Strait, we totally understand that it is not easy at all to talk to the Russian Federation, but we are the university, so we got that going for us. We're not a federal agency. Is there anything that IARC, the International Arctic Research Agency, can do with, like, I think there's a international Department of Commerce office. There's an international Department of the Interior office. Those are like, there's the State Department. There's the Bering Strait, how we communicate, how we have to get information that may be life and death across, what that takes, and nowadays all the other people it takes. Is there anything that IARC can, I always think, that's the prize for me, is to be able to talk across, because it can't be done unofficially, because the penalties now are very dangerous for citizenry who are unaware on either side, to be thinking you could just pick up and, talk about marine issues, right? There's a lot of federal oversight and so forth, and resource and economics and things like that. But we still have issues that are threatening human life, threatening creating conservation concerns for threatened marine wildlife. And how do we, in your note, thinking about that Russian picture for the Bering Strait region, what would success look like to you? Is there that, I know you had a couple of dots over on, maybe must have been earlier cruises when people could pop over and, whatever, get permission or share, Russian scientists or things like that, share data, ships, I don't know. But what would success look like for you for the roads in the Bering Strait region, the transboundary?
Well, yeah, that was a lot packed into a question. I think,
Okay.
my understanding is right. The Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, all the signatories, including Russia, they're still talking, right? This is not, so there's government to government conversations that pertain CAO fisheries agreement. The same, the agreements the US has with Russia about salmon management, I don't know where that is. And the last time I asked about it, which was a while ago, there was still conversations, and of course there's informal conversations with, individual researchers. Like at our institute, a number of people, are collaborating, for a long time with Russian colleagues. So there's that going on. But of course, that latter part gets more and more difficult, including for people over in Russia. So you have to be very mindful. And of course, you don't want to, certainly some of us communicating with the Department of State to make sure that we're not running counter to any broader considerations that we
Yeah.
need to be. So there's a lot going on, under
Yep.
the surface, but clearly, it's still a big challenge, in terms of the broader geopolitical order, right? That we're talking about the Arctic. You can't talk about the Arctic if you don't include Russian waters, say if you're talking about marine environments. I mean, that's a significant part of the Arctic Ocean. So,
Well, for Bering Strait, I would say you're observing the fact that you still are able to communicate and get data. Is that being shared? Ultimately, I'm sure it is. But for us living in the Bering Strait region, knowing there are avenues, could we use your system to
my sense is right now,
understand?
not really. Like, if you have a very specific question, I would refer you to some of our researchers who are working with Russian collaborators still. But again, like it's a very sensitive situation.
Yeah, no,
don't think
I wouldn't
we'll
say
get at
you.
the questions that you
Yeah.
were asking specifically, to me.
I'm asking about big management, or, how are seabirds, what is anomalous? And that's because I'm interested in marine biological resources, whereas you may be interested in something not so difficult, management wise and research wise, like ice, right? Or temperature, totally super important, but not having all the other issues involved. So thank you very much. But yeah, that's the question. Thank you. Thank you. Given that, thank you all for staying on. With no other questions, we'll shut her down. And Hajo, if you don't mind staying on for 1 second after everybody says goodnight, we'll say thank you, goodbye to 2023, and we all better learn to adapt to 2024 as it is coming on us here. So happy holidays, Merry Christmas to everybody. And the next Straight Science will be January 11th, 2024. And we'll be looking at the Fish and Wildlife Service will be talking to us, and they're going to be talking about the pending or ongoing 5-year review to see if the Pacific walrus is going to be put on the endangered species list or not. They're going to break down the whole process and give us more information about what is underway right now for that. So we're looking forward to that. And we'll see you all next year. Have a good night, everyone. Be careful if you're in the region. It's going to be cold and windy, very cold. Take care traveling. Good night, everybody.